Maeve Jenkins kept her fingers pressed against the rough grain of the oak table as she checked the columns of numbers one last time. The tallow candle beside her inkwell was burning low, its wick curling into a black knot that threatened to drown in the melting wax. For 3 hours, she had been tracking the shipments of white pine from the upper valley down to the river mouth, and 2 cords of wood remained completely missing from the final balance sheet. It was the 3rd time this month the timber mill accounts had shown a discrepancy, and she knew the local workers were too tired from the early winter freeze to notice a clerical error. She picked up her steel pen, dipped it carefully into the black ink, and began to write a note to the foreman in her clean, unhurried handwriting. She did not hear the front door open against the autumn wind, but she felt the cold air move across the floorboards a second before Gwen stepped into the room. Gwen did not take off her heavy wool cloak. She simply walked straight to the table and blew out the candle with a sharp puff of air that left the room in sudden gray darkness. "Pack 1 small trunk," Gwen said, her voice clear and completely settled in its purpose. "The carriage is coming at 5 o'clock in the morning, and we are leaving for the coast before the sun clears the tree line." Maeve did not move from her chair, though she could feel the cold ink drying on her fingertips in the dark. "The mill manager needs these sheets by Monday morning, Gwen, and the winter supplies have not been fully cleared by the town selectmen yet." Gwen reached down, closed the heavy leather ledger with a solid thud, and slid the inkwell out of Maeve's reach. "The mill will stand for 10 days without you, and the selectmen will survive the delay because they have no choice. The Brightons have opened their house in Rockport, the rest of the girls are already there, and I am not spending another season watching you turn into a piece of office furniture." Maeve sat in the quiet room for 30 seconds, listening to the wind rattle the loose pane in the kitchen window, before she stood up and found her lantern. The journey from the green hills of Vermont down to the Massachusetts coast took the better part of 2 days, the carriage wheels churning through the damp ruts of the post road. Maeve spent the first 4 hours trying to calculate the interest on the town road bonds in her head, but by the afternoon of the 2nd day, she gave up and watched the trees thin out into low scrub pine and gray rock. The air changed first, losing the sharp scent of hemlock and taking on the heavy, damp smell of salt, mud, and dying seaweed. When the horses finally turned down the long gravel drive of the Brighton estate, the sun was sinking behind a bank of purple clouds, throwing a cold light across the water. The house was built of gray fieldstone, its 2 wings extending toward the ocean like stone arms, with tall windows that showed the yellow glow of oil lamps within. Maeve waited until the driver had secured the horses before she stepped out, carrying her single wooden trunk by its iron handle, without waiting for the house staff to come down the steps. Inside, the house smelled of beeswax, lemon oil, and the dry heat of multiple wood fires burning in the public rooms. Gwen had already disappeared toward the kitchen to find hot water, but Lydia was sitting in the main parlor, her yellow silk dress spread out around her like a bell as she worked on a piece of white embroidery. She dropped her needle when Maeve entered and stood up, her movements deliberate and graceful in the way of someone who had spent 3 winters in Boston learning how to walk across a room. "You are the last to arrive, Maeve," Lydia said, offering a small, cool hand that smelled faintly of lavender water. "Fiona was certain you would stay in the hills to count the pine logs, but I told her you would not let Gwen make the trip alone." Maeve took her hand briefly, noting the small ink stain on her own thumb, before she pulled it back into her sleeve. "The road was soft, near the state line," Maeve said simply. "We lost 2 hours at the river crossing." Fiona came down the wide central staircase a moment later, her fingers dark with charcoal dust, and her apron tied crookedly over her gray wool dress. She did not shake hands. She simply grabbed Maeve by the elbow and pulled her toward the eastern windows that looked out over the stone terrace. "The light here is completely different from the mountains," Fiona said, pointing out toward the dark line of the sea. "It has no color at all in the evening, just different shades of iron and silver, and the house next door looks like an island when the tide comes up." Maeve looked past the low stone wall that marked the Brighton boundary, noting the massive dark outline of the adjacent property, its chimneys rising against the sky like black fingers. No lights were burning in any of the windows she could see, though a thin wisp of pale smoke was rising from a single stone flue near the rear. Audrey joined them from the library, an old volume of history tucked under her arm and her spectacles hanging from a black ribbon around her neck. She looked at Maeve with her usual quiet scrutiny, her eyes steady behind her faint smile. "The ledgers are balanced, then?" Audrey asked, her voice low enough to stay beneath the sound of Lydia's laughter from the parlor. "They are as close to balance as they will get until the spring thaw," Maeve replied, setting her trunk down by the corner cupboard. Audrey nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Then leave them there. The ocean does not keep accounts, and neither do we, for the next week." Maeve's room was on the second floor of the eastern wing, a narrow space with a whitewashed wall and an iron bedstead that faced the water. A small door opened onto a stone balcony that was barely 3 feet wide, just enough space for a person to stand and look down at the rocks below. She spent 10 minutes unpacking her 3 plain dresses, her extra boots, and the thick leather volume of natural philosophy she had carried from her father's study. By the time she went back downstairs, the other 4 women were gathered around the long table in the dining room, the oil lamps turned low to keep the evening bugs away from the glass. The meal was simple, consisting of cold mutton, baked bread, and a bowl of winter apples that had survived the journey from the south. Lydia talked about the families who had taken houses along the shore for the season, listing names and incomes with the familiar precision of an auctioneer. Maeve ate her bread and listened to the steady roar of the surf against the beach, a sound that felt much closer now that the wind had dropped. When the dinner was cleared, she took her book and her lantern, walked out through the side door, and found a gray wooden bench near the water's edge. She did not open the volume immediately. She sat and watched the black water move against the sand, feeling the cold air settle into her clothes like wool. The second morning brought a thin, high fog that hung over the water until noon, turning the sun into a white disk that gave no heat to the stones. Maeve had completed her walk along the high tide line before Gwen or Lydia had come down to the breakfast room. She had found 3 pieces of green glass, smooth as coins, a dried crab shell, and a small piece of oak timbers from an old wreck, all of which she left on the stone wall by the garden gate. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the fog had lifted enough to show the full curve of the bay, and the 5 women had moved down to the dry sand below the terrace. Lydia had brought a folding canvas chair and a large green parasol, while Fiona sat on a wool blanket with her sketchbook open on her knees, her charcoal pencil moving in quick, sharp strokes. Maeve was sitting on a flat stone 20 yards down the beach, her leather book open to a chapter on the movement of tides, when she felt the change in the air. It was not a sound, but rather the sudden stillness that comes over a flock of birds when a shadow passes over the field. She looked up from her page and saw a man walking down the narrow cliff path that led from the adjacent estate. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath a plain black coat that had no brass buttons or velvet trim to show his station. His hair was completely white, the color of clean bone or fresh snow, and it caught the thin sunlight in a way that made him visible long before he reached the level sand. His skin was the same pale shade, lacking the red tone that the sea wind usually gave to the men who lived along the coast. He walked with a smooth, unhurried stride that carried him past the brightened boundary wall without a pause. He did not look at Lydia under her green parasol, nor did he look at Fiona's sketch. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the gray water met the white sky. As he came closer, Maeve noticed that he carried no cane, no gloves, and no hat, despite the cold wind that was beginning to blow from the east. The house staff from the Brighton estate, who had been carrying wood to the terrace fire, stopped their work entirely and stood by the stone pillars, their arms full of birch logs, watching him pass with a quiet, rigid attention. Lydia's parasol tilted slightly as he drew level with their group. She did not speak, but her chin rose by an inch, her embroidery sitting idle in her lap as she watched him move toward the water. Gwen let out a small, sharp breath through her teeth, her fingers tightening around the handle of her workbasket. "That is Cassian Drake," Lydia said, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely cleared the sound of the small waves. "The family has owned the entire northern point since the time of the colony. but no one has seen him in the town since the winter before last. They say he does not use the roads at all. He only travels by water at night. He looks like he has never spent an hour in the sun," Fiona said, her pencil hovering over her paper without touching it. "Look at his hands. They look like they are carved from river stone." Maeve looked at the man's hands as he stopped near the water's edge. They were long-fingered and perfectly still, hanging by his sides, without the slight twitching common to men who were used to handling reins or pens. He stood 3 feet from the surf, his boots sinking into the wet gravel, and remained there for 5 minutes without moving a single muscle in his face. "They call him the King of the North Shore in the village," Audrey said, walking down from the terrace to join them on the sand. "The local fishermen won't cast their nets near his docks after dark. They say the fish go deep when his boat passes, and the water stays black behind his rudder for an hour." Maeve turned a page in her book, the paper making a dry, cracking sound in the silence. "He is simply a man with white hair who prefers his own beach," Maeve said, her voice even. "The timber mill in Vermont has 3 workers whose hair turned white before they were 30 from the winter damp." Lydia laughed, but it was a quick, nervous sound that died out before it reached the water. "He is not a mill worker, Maeve. He owns 40,000 acres of spruce in Maine and 3 banks in Boston, and he has never signed a lease or taken a partner in 50 years. The white-haired man turned his head then, slowly, as if he had heard his name across the 20 yards of wind and sand. His eyes were not blue or gray like the coastal people. They were a dark, clear amber that looked completely black from a distance. He looked straight past Lydia's green parasol and Fiona's sketchbook, his gaze landing on Maeve, where she sat on her flat stone with her book in her lap. He did not bow or acknowledge her with a nod. He simply looked at her for 3 seconds with the steady, unblinking attention of a hawk on a branch. Then he turned and walked back up the cliff path, his dark coat disappearing into the gray rocks before the tide could reach his footprints. The dinner on the 4th evening was a larger affair, arranged by Mrs. Brighton to welcome the few neighbors who remained on the point so late in the autumn. The long table was set with the old blue willow china, and 12 candles in silver sticks were lit down the center, their flames dancing in the draught that came from the large kitchen pantry. Maeve sat between Audrey and an elderly gentleman named Mr. Corliss, who spent the first 2 courses explaining the proper method for salting cod for the West Indies trade. Maeve listened politely, nodding when he paused for breath, while her eyes moved down the length of the white cloth to where Cassian Drake sat at the right hand of their hostess. He had changed into a dark evening coat of plain wool, his white cravat tied with a single knot that had no pins or lace. In the yellow candlelight, his skin looked translucent, like fine porcelain that had been kept in a dark cupboard for a century. He did not touch the roasted duck or the boiled potatoes on his plate. He occasionally lifted a glass of dark water to his lips, but Maeve noticed that the level of the liquid did not seem to drop. He spoke few words, but when he answered Mrs. Brighton's questions about the northern timber limits, his voice was low and resonant, carrying the peculiar depth of an iron bell rung underwater. Lydia sat opposite him, her hair dressed with 2 silk ribbons that matched her blue gown. She spent the meal attempting to draw him into a conversation about the winter assembly in Boston, but her questions seemed to slide off his quiet presence like rain off a slate roof. "The winter is very long on the point, Mr. Drake," Lydia said, her fork balancing a small piece of cake. "One must have society to keep from freezing entirely." Cassian looked at her, his amber eyes catching the reflection of the 2 center candles. "The ice keeps its own company, Miss Lydia," he said. "It does not require assistance to stay cold." It was during the removal of the main platters that the accident occurred. An old woman named Martha, who had worked in the Brighton kitchen since Maeve was a child, came through the pantry door carrying a large pewter basin filled with hot broth and winter roots. Her left ankle had been stiff since the great frost of 3 winters ago, and as she stepped onto the polished pine floorboards of the dining room, her foot caught on the edge of the braided rug. The heavy basin tilted, the hot grease splashing over her fingers, and she let out a small cry as the metal dish clattered against the corner of the sideboard. The table went completely silent, the kind of sharp, collective breath that happens when someone breaks a piece of expensive glass in front of company. Mrs. Brighton's face went white at the corners of her mouth, and Lydia pulled her blue silk skirt back with a quick, jerky movement to avoid the greasy water that was beginning to spread across the dark wood. Mr. Corliss stopped his story mid-sentence, his fork suspended 2 inches from his plate. No one moved from their chairs. The guests sat frozen, looking either at the ceiling or at their own napkins, while Martha knelt on the floor, her old hands trembling as she tried to gather the hot pieces of parsnip with her bare fingers. Maeve did not look at Mrs. Brighton for permission. She stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floorboards, and walked down the length of the table before Gwen could catch her sleeve. She knelt on the wet pine beside the old woman, took the hot pewter basin from her shaking grip, and set it firmly against the base of the sideboard where it could not slide. "Go down to the kitchen and put some cold lard on those fingers, Martha," Maeve said, her voice quiet and completely flat, the same tone she used when telling a cabin boy to rest his torn hand. "I will take the plates down when we are finished here." The old woman looked up, her eyes watery with shame and pain, but she stood up slowly, her stiff apron rattling as she retreated through the dark pantry door. Maeve did not stand up immediately. She took her linen handkerchief from her pocket, wiped the worst of the greasy broth from the floorboards, and stacked the 3 broken pieces of the china rim into a neat pile. When she finally straightened and turned back to the table, she found Cassian Drake looking at her. He had not moved from his seat, but his long, pale hands were flat against the white cloth, and his amber eyes were wide, fixed on her face with a strange, heavy intensity that felt like a hand pressing against her chest. She did not lower her head. She walked back to her seat, sat down, and picked up her napkin as if she had done nothing more than pass the salt cellar. The next morning, the sky was the color of an old iron kettle, and a fine, dry snow was beginning to drift down between the pine trees along the road. Maeve put on her heavy boots and her gray wool cloak, intending to walk the mile into Rockport to find some white paper and a bottle of black ink for her winter letters. The village was small, a single row of gray clapboard shops facing the stone wharf where 3 fishing smacks were tied to the pilings. She found the stationer's shop at the corner of the lane, a low-ceilinged room that smelled of dried hemp, tobacco, and old calfskin. The shopkeeper was an old man with a leather apron who was busy transferring small lead balls from a wooden keg into canvas sacks. Maeve had selected 2 sheets of thick rag paper and was examining the nibs of the steel pens when the bell above the door gave a single, muffled clink. The wind did not blow into the shop, but the air became suddenly cold, the way the air inside a stone well feels in the middle of July. Maeve did not turn around until she heard the shopkeeper drop his lead balls back into the keg with a heavy, hollow rattle. Cassian Drake stood inside the low doorway, his head nearly touching the dark beams of the ceiling. He was wearing his plain black coat, and his white hair was lightly dusted with the dry snow from the lane, but he did not shiver or tuck his hands into his pockets. He looked around the small shop with a quiet, neutral expression until his eyes found Maeve standing by the ink shelf. "The paper from the valley is better for letters," he said, his voice dropping into the quiet room like a stone into dry grass. "The coastal paper has too much salt in the fiber. The ink spreads before it can dry." Maeve looked down at the 2 sheets in her hand, noting the slightly gray tint of the paper. "The valley paper is 4 cents more a sheet in the village," she said, looking back up at his pale face. "For a letter to a timber foreman, the salt paper will serve well enough." Cassian walked 2 steps closer, his boots making no sound at all on the sawdust that covered the floorboards. "The foreman will not read it if the ink runs," he said. He reached into his coat pocket, drew out a small wooden box wrapped in green twine, and laid it on the counter beside her paper. "Use this. It was made in Philadelphia before the war." The shopkeeper had retreated to the very back of his counter, his hands tucked under his leather apron, his eyes fixed on the floor between his boots. Maeve looked from the wooden box to Cassian's amber eyes, which looked lighter now in the gray light from the street window. "I do not take gifts from neighbors I have not bidden good morning to, Mr. Drake," she said, her voice remaining steady and unhurried. Cassian did not move his hand from the counter. "It is not a gift, Miss Jenkins. It is an exchange. You did not look away from the floor last night, when the others were busy with their own skirts." They walked out of the shop together 3 minutes later, the snow falling thicker now, covering the black gravel of the lane with a thin white skin. They did not separate at the corner. By some silent agreement that neither spoke aloud, they turned down the narrow path that led toward the harbor tea room, a low stone building where a small peat fire was smoking in the hearth. The room was empty of other customers at that hour. The two wooden tables near the window, looking out over the gray pilings and the dark water of the basin. They sat opposite each other by the window, a young girl with red hair bringing them a pot of black tea and 2 earthenware mugs without being asked. She set the pot down with a trembling hand, her eyes sliding sideways toward Cassian's white hair, before she hurried back to the kitchen behind the counter. Maeve poured the tea, noting that when Cassian took his mug, his fingers did not steam against the hot clay, nor did any breath show from his lips as he blew across the dark liquid. "You have been counting the logs in the southern valley," Cassian said, his eyes fixed on the harbor mouth, where a single boat was trying to clear the bar. "The Brighton family thinks you are here to find a husband with a house in Boston." Maeve took a sip of her tea, the warmth welcome after the walk down the lane. "The Brighton family thinks many things that do not appear on my balance sheets," she said. "The timber mill has 400 workers who require their wages before the river freezes, and my father's eyes are too dim to read the small figures in the ledger. That is my occupation." Cassian looked at her for a long moment, his face as still as the stone walls of the harbor. "An occupation is a short thing," he said. "People spend 30 years counting their logs or their money, and then they are laid under the slate stones by the church wall, and the trees grow back over their ditches in another 10. I have watched 4 generations of the Brighton family come to this beach to wear their silk dresses, and not one of them could tell you the depth of the channel outside the point." Maeve set her mug down with a small click. "The channel is 24 feet at low water," she said. "The timber boats from the north cannot clear the bar if they carry more than 80 cords. I checked the charts before we left Vermont." Cassian's amber eyes flared slightly, a sudden gold light showing in the dark centers, and for the first time since she had seen him, the corners of his mouth lifted in something that was almost a smile. The wind died out completely by midnight, leaving the coast under a heavy, freezing silence that made the timber of the Brighton house creak as the frost took hold of the beams. Maeve had tried to read her chapter on the star charts, but the room was too cold for her fingers to turn the pages without tearing the paper. She wrapped her wool shawl twice around her shoulders, opened the small balcony door, and stepped out onto the narrow stone ledge to look at the water. The sea was completely flat, a sheet of black glass that showed the stars as small, sharp points of ice. The moon was high and white, casting a pale light that made the gray stones of the adjacent cliff look like old teeth rising from the sand. She had been standing there for 5 minutes when she noticed a figure standing at the very edge of the neighboring terrace, less than 20 feet away, across the narrow stone gap that separated the 2 properties. Cassian Drake was standing with his back to the house, his white hair shining in the moonlight like silver wire. He was wearing only his white shirt, the linen open at the neck despite the frost that was already forming on the iron railing before him. He held no glass and no pipe. He was simply leaning against the stone wall, his face turned upward toward the cold sky. He did not turn his head when she stepped out, but his voice came across the dark air as clearly as if he were standing 2 feet from her elbow. "The stars are 3 days late this winter," he said. "The frost should have cleared the sky by Tuesday." Maeve gripped the iron rail of her balcony, her fingers feeling the sharp bite of the cold metal through her wool mitts. "The calendar says nothing about Tuesday," she said. "The almanac predicted a soft November until the full moon." Cassian turned slowly, his pale face looking almost blue under the moonlight. "The almanac was written by men who sleep under goose down after 6 o'clock, he said. "They do not feel the water changing 3 miles out." "Do you spend all your nights out here, Mr. Drake?" Maeve asked, her voice dropping into the quiet space between the stone walls. "The girls say you do not keep the same hours as the town." Cassian leaned his hip against the stone rail, his movements carrying that strange, fluid ease that had no hurry in it. "Sleep is for those who are growing older, Miss Jenkins," he said. "When you have seen the same winter 30 times in a row, you do not need to close your eyes to know what the dark looks like. I have work that does not go well in the daylight." "The shipping lines?" Maeve asked. Cassian shook his head once, his white hair catching the silver light. "The lines belong to my nephews in Boston. They think they manage them because they sign the papers with their black ink. I manage the people who allow the ships to come into the bays after the lanterns are out. There are families on this coast who have paid their bills with my silver since the king's men were in the province." Maeve looked at his long, pale hands resting on the frost-covered stone. "The village people are afraid of you," she said simply. "Audrey says the fishermen change their courses when they see your chimney smoke." Cassian looked down at the black water below the rocks, his amber eyes dimming until they looked like old copper coins. "They are right to keep their distance," he said. "Not because I intend them harm, but because the things that do not change are dangerous for those who must die in the spring. A man who lives through 3 of their lifetimes is like a rock in the middle of a horse path. They will break their wheels against him if they do not look where they are driving. I have managed 3 timber mills where the water wheel stayed the same, while the boys who carried the logs grew old and died," Maeve said, her voice remaining steady in the cold. "The wheel does not apologize for staying grease-stained, and the boys do not blame the wood for being hard. They simply do the work until they are finished." Cassian looked up from the rocks, his amber eyes fixing on her face with that same unblinking stare she had seen on the beach. "You have a very cold mind, Maeve Jenkins," he said, using her name for the first time without her title. "It is the only thing on this point that does not smell of old rosewater and fear." Maeve did not answer. She stepped back into her room, closed the small door against the frost, and slept until the sun was 3 hours high. The grand gala was held on the 6th evening at the mansion of Arthur Pendleton, a man who had made his fortune in the China trade and had built a house that looked like a white wooden temple on the highest hill above the bay. The ballroom was 3 times the size of the Brighton parlor, its floor made of white oak planks that had been waxed until they reflected the 70 candles burning in the 3 brass chandeliers above. The walls were covered with green silk paper, and an orchestra from Boston was positioned in the corner, the violins playing a loud, fast tune that kept 20 couples moving across the floor in a cloud of silk and lace. Maeve stood near the rear window, her gray wool dress looking dark and plain against the green wall, her fingers holding a small glass of cider that had gone flat. Lydia was in the center of the room, her gold gown turning in wide circles as she danced with a young lawyer from Salem, her face bright with the heat of the candles. Gwen was by the refreshment table, talking animatedly with 2 elderly women about the price of winter flour, while Fiona sat in the corner window seat, her small pencil moving secretly inside her sleeve as she drew the fat cheeks of the flute player. Cassian Drake arrived an hour after the music had begun. He did not use the main entrance where the carriages were lined up. He appeared through the side door that led from the garden terrace, his black coat showing no signs of the snow that was beginning to coat the windows. He did not speak to Arthur Pendleton, nor did he join the line of gentlemen waiting to dance with the daughters of the Salem merchants. He walked straight through the crowd, the dancers parting before his smooth stride like sheep before a hound, his white hair drawing every eye in the room within 10 seconds of his arrival. Maeve watched him move toward her corner, her face remaining neutral as he stopped 2 feet away, his back to the green silk wall. "The music is too loud for a small room," he said, his voice coming under the violins without effort. "It keeps the horses in the stable from sleeping." Maeve did not turn her head from the window. "The horses are used to the wind, Mr. Drake," she said. "The music will not hurt them if the doors are barred." Before Cassian could reply, Arthur Pendleton walked across the floor, his red waistcoat stretched tight over his round stomach, his gold-headed cane tapping against the oak planks with a sharp, rhythmic click. He stopped in front of Maeve, his face carrying that peculiar smile of an old merchant who had just found an error in an invoice. "Miss Jenkins," Pendleton said, his voice loud enough to cause the nearest dancers to slow their steps. "We are surprised to find you so far from the counting house this evening." I had understood from your father that you were busy with the timber tallies in the mountains. Maeve looked at him, her glass of cider remaining steady in her hand. The tallies are completed for the season, Mr. Pendleton, she said. Pendleton smiled wider, his eyes moving over her plain gray wool dress with a slow, calculating look. How fortunate. Though one wonders if a young woman who spends so many hours with the black ink might find the pleasures of a ballroom rather beyond her comprehension. The social world requires a different kind of calculation than the price of spruce logs, my dear. Two of the Salem merchants stopped their conversation to listen, their wives tilting their feather fans to hear better above the violins. Maeve was about to tell him the exact cost of his white pine siding when Cassian Drake stepped forward by 6 inches, his tall figure casting a long, dark shadow across Pendleton's red waistcoat. The yellow candlelight seemed to die out in his amber eyes, leaving them as black and flat as 2 pools of mountain water in December. The calculation is exactly the same, Arthur, Cassian said, his voice dropping into the room with a cold weight that made the nearest violin player miss his chord entirely. Miss Jenkins manages an estate that has paid its taxes in gold since your father was selling dried fish from a handcart on the wharf. She knows the weight of an honest contract, and she knows when a merchant has used 3 inches of green wood to pad his shipping boxes in the winter of '56. Pendleton's face changed from red to a mottled, damp white, his round fingers tightening around the gold head of his cane until the metal groaned. He opened his mouth to speak, but Cassian did not look at him again. He kept his eyes fixed on the merchant's face until the older man turned on his heel and walked back toward the musician's platform with a quick, uneven step that looked like a retreat. The surrounding guests began to talk all at once, their voices rising to cover the silence, and the violins took up a new tune with a sudden, frantic speed. Maeve set her flat cider down on the window ledge. "You should not have said that about his father," she said, her voice dropping into the small space between them. "The old man died 30 years ago." Cassian looked down at her, his white hair catching the green reflection from the wallpaper. "The old man was an honest thief," he said. "The son is a dishonest gentleman. I do not like to see a person who can balance a ledger being lectured by a man who cannot keep his own skin from shaking when the wind blows from the north." Maeve looked at him for 5 seconds before she turned, found her gray cloak in the entry hall, and walked back to the Brighton house alone through the dark snow. Audrey was waiting by the parlor fire when Maeve came through the side door, her old history book lying unread on her knees, her spectacles tucked into her pocket. She did not ask about the gala or the music. She waited until Maeve had taken off her wet boots and laid her wool shawl over the copper screen to dry before she spoke. "He followed you from the town square yesterday, Maeve," Audrey said, her voice low in the quiet house. "I saw him from the upper window. He stayed 30 paces behind you until you reached our gate, and then he stood by the rock wall for an hour without his hat." Maeve sat down on the hearth rug, her hands extended toward the red coals of the birch logs. "The road is public, Audrey," she said. "A man may stand by a stone wall if he chooses." Audrey leaned forward, her face serious in the firelight. "You are doing the thing you do with the timber contracts, Maeve. You are looking at the figures to see where the fraud is. You are looking for the error in the column so you can reject the offer and go back to your desk in the mountains." "The offer has not been made," Maeve said, her eyes fixed on a blue flame that was dancing along a split in the birch bark. "He is a neighbor who has lived here a very long time and has no friends left who remember his name. That is all." Audrey shook her head, a slow, tired movement. "He is the king of this shore, Maeve. He has been here since my grandfather was a boy, and he will be here when our children's children are old women in their caps. He does not want a contract. He wants someone who can look at his white hair and his cold hands without thinking he is a ghost or a monster." "I know what he is," Maeve said, her voice dropping, until it was nearly lost in the hiss of the sap. "He has no pulse in his wrist, Audrey. I felt his hand when he passed the wooden box in the shop. It was like touching the iron plate on a winter sled. His breath does not show in the frost, and his eyes look like the eyes of the owls that stay in our barn through the great snows." "And you are afraid?" Audrey said softly. Maeve turned her head, her face pale but completely steady in the red light of the hearth. I am not afraid of his cold hands, Audrey. I am afraid of what happens to the timber mill if I stay here until the spring thaw. I am 30 years old, and I have spent 12 of those years keeping my father's house and my father's books, and I know exactly how much wood it takes to keep a family from freezing for 5 months. I do not know what to do with a man who does not require wood and who does not change when the years go by. The mill will burn or it will stand, Maeve, Audrey said, standing up and pulling her shawl around her shoulders as she prepared to go up the stairs. But you cannot spend the rest of your life counting the logs just because you know how many there are. Sometimes the ledger must be closed before the page is full. Maeve stayed by the fire for another hour, until the birch logs had turned to gray ash, and the room was so cold she could see her own breath as a thin white cloud in the dark. She rose early, before the first crow had called from the pines, and walked down to the beach, where the gray wooden chair sat near the high tide mark. The water was gray and heavy under the dawn sky, and the snow had stopped, leaving the sand covered with a white crust that crackled under her boots. Cassian Drake came down the cliff path before the sun had cleared the eastern headland, his black coat buttoned to his chin, his white hair looking sharp against the gray rock behind him. He did not stop at the boundary wall this time. He walked straight to where she stood by the wooden chair, his long, pale hands tucked into his sleeves, his amber eyes fixed on her face with that same heavy stillness she had come to expect. "I leave for the northern forests on Friday morning," he said, his voice clear in the cold dawn air. "The logging crews in Maine have found a seam of white cedar that needs my mark before they can cut the timber." He paused, his gaze moving over her gray wool cloak and the dark hair that had escaped from her hood. "I am telling you this because I do not intend to leave this coast without your permission to write to you in Vermont." Maeve looked past him to where the Brighton house stood gray against the hill, its windows still dark with sleep. "My father does not care for letters from Boston or the coast, Mr. Drake," she said. "He thinks the people here have too many words for small things." Cassian took his hands from his sleeves, his fingers looking long and white against his black wool. "I am not writing to your father, Maeve. I am writing to the woman who cleaned the grease from the floorboards while the others were thinking of their blue dresses. I am writing to the only person I have met in 50 years who looks at my face instead of my banks." He stepped 3 inches closer, and Maeve could feel the coldness that came from his skin, a steady, clean draft that smelled of deep river ice and old spruce needles. "I will come to the valley in the winter," he said, his voice dropping into that low, bell-like register that stayed in the ear long after he had finished speaking. "I will come when the roads are barred with 5 feet of snow and the horses cannot move from the stable. I do not require a carriage to travel, and I do not need a road to find the timber mill." Maeve looked at his amber eyes, seeing her own small, gray reflection in the dark centers. She thought of her oak table in Vermont, the neat columns of figures, the 300 pine logs, and the long, quiet evenings by the dying kitchen fire. She had been satisfied with those things. She had told herself that the balance sheet was enough for a life if it was kept clean and true. But as she looked at the white-haired man standing before her in the gray light, she knew the ledger was already changing, its margins expanding into something that had no numbers and no end. "The house is 3 miles past the church crossing," she said, her voice remaining unhurried and clear in the wind. "The gate is painted white, but the snow usually covers the latch by December. You will have to use the kitchen door. The front lock has been rusted shut since the year of the Great Frost." Cassian didn't bow or thank her. His amber eyes simply brightened until they looked like coals under an iron grate. And he turned and walked back up the cliff path without looking back once. Maeve stood by the gray chair until the sun finally broke through the clouds, turning the white snow on the sand into a sheet of silver that was too bright to look at for long. The journey back to the green hills of Vermont was longer than the trip down, the carriage horses slipping on the frozen ruts of the road as the early winter gales began to blow from the north. Maeve sat in her corner with her leather volume in her lap, her fingers tracing the old gold tooling on the spine, while Gwen slept against her shoulder, her breath coming in slow, regular puffs against the wool of her cloak. The Brighton house was closed now, its windows shuttered with gray pine boards until the spring, and the beach by Rockport was left to the crows and the high tides that came up over the flat stones. 11 weeks passed in the ordinary way, the days marked by the short light and the heavy smell of wood smoke that hung over the valley from the mill chimneys. Maeve rose every morning at 5 o'clock, lit the kitchen hearth with 3 birch splits, and sat at her oak table with the big ledger until her father came down in his wool slippers to ask about the weather. The foreman wrote twice about the missing white pine logs, and she found the error on a Tuesday afternoon a simple mistake of 40 cords that had been credited to the wrong river driver in the month of September. She corrected the figure with 2 strokes of her pen and felt nothing at all as she closed the book. It was a Thursday in January when she heard the sound of wheels on the gravel drive. The snow had been falling since the previous night, 3 feet of dry, white powder that covered the stone walls and reached the sills of the lower windows, leaving the valley completely silent under a gray sky. No carriage from the village had moved since Tuesday, and the mail rider had left his horse at the church crossing 2 miles down the lane. Maeve did not get up from her chair immediately. She sat with her hands resting on the cold leather of the ledger, listening to the slow, heavy step that was moving up the kitchen path through the deep drifts. It was a footstep that made no sound of crunching crust or breaking ice. It was a steady, smooth presence that moved through the snow as if the white powder were nothing more than gray dust on a parlor floor. She did not look out the window to confirm the white hair or the black wool coat. She stood up, took her wool shawl from the iron hook by the chimney, and walked straight to the kitchen door. When she drew back the heavy oak bolt, the cold air came in like a knife, carrying a fine cloud of white snow that settled over her boots and the dark pine floorboards. Cassian Drake was standing on the stone step, his head nearly touching the low lintel of the porch, his white hair completely free of snow despite the gale that was blowing through the orchard behind him. His amber eyes were wide and bright in the gray light of the afternoon, and when he looked at her, his pale face carried no sign of the long journey through the frozen hills. He did not ask to come in, and he did not speak of the 3 months that had passed since the beach at Rockport. He simply reached out a long, pale hand and held open the heavy door against the wind. Maeve looked past his black sleeve to the white valley below, seeing the long winter stretching out toward the mountains, the cold rivers staying silent under their 3 feet of blue ice until the spring thaw came to clear the channels. She knew the mill would still require her numbers, and her father would still need his tea by the fire, but she knew also that the kitchen door would never be completely bolted again against the things that stayed the same while the wood burned down to ash. She stepped out onto the stone sill, her gray wool dress catching the wind as she stood beside him in the cold, and the door closed behind them with a solid, final click that left the ledger inside completely dark. The future does not arrive with a great noise or a sudden turning of the sun. It moves into a life the way the winter fog moves through the pine woods, filling the empty ditches and softening the sharp edges of the stone walls until the landscape looks completely different, without a single rock having been moved from its place. Maeve Jenkins sat by the small window of the timber house as the February light began to die behind the ridge, her fingers unhurried as she knitted a pair of heavy gray mitts from the wool she had spun before the first frost. She did not look at the clock on the shelf, for she had come to understand that the hours are only important to those who have a short time to spend them, and the numbers in her old ledger had begun to look like the small marks the birds leave on the snow before the wind takes them away. A life is not a sum of cords or dollars, nor is it a performance to be managed in front of the neighbors who come to the kitchen door to see if the fire is still burning. It is a long, quiet negotiation with the things that do not change, a willingness to stand by a white-haired man in the dark when the rest of the valley has gone to sleep under their goose down, and to find that the coldness of his hand is nothing more than the temperature of the deep earth before the trees began to grow. She could hear the wind moving through the spruce logs on the mountain, a steady, ancient sound that had no anger in it, and she knew that when the spring came, the river would run high and the logs would go down to the sea exactly as they had for 50 years. But she would not be counting them from the shore. She would be watching the water clear from the high stone terrace where the channels were deep enough for the ships to pass without a chart. and where the silence between two people was long enough to hold all the winters that were still to come.